Good afternoon, everybody. It's 1 o'clock for me here on the West Coast, which means it's 4 o'clock on the East Coast, and go ahead and get started. It's a little bit of a different format for me here doing this online, and I know we don't get the same interaction as we would with a live audience. So feel free to put any comments in the chat, and I'll do my best to be looking over there as we go through the presentation. So I'm here to share with you about React Native, continuous integration, and some end-to-end integration testing. My name is Jennifer Robinson, and I work for a digital agency called EchoBind. And you can find me on GitHub and Twitter at CNJets. So what we'll cover today are some different types of testing available, understanding end-to-end testing options for React Native, how we have a React Native template that can help you really jumpstart some projects, integration into continuous integration services like Bitrise or CircleCI, and then my learnings along this journey. So before we get into that, just a little bit about myself. I started my career actually as an administrative assistant at the age of 18, but I knew that was just a stepping stone to bigger things. I was able to gain some efficiencies in my role and show my manager I was willing and able to take on additional work. So I started working on our department websites, using really simple WYSIWYG editors back in the day of like Front Page and learning basic HTML. Got into some JavaScript and just continued to grow from there. So I consider myself a forever student. I love to learn. Never really considered myself an engineer until I was actually able to speak at the Society of Women Engineers conference. And at that point I was like, well, I guess I can't say I'm not an engineer anymore. I'm also an EMT and a firefighter. I have 3 wonderful children and my amazing husband who supports me through all of this. So you can find me chauffeuring kids around, during normal times to sports and all sorts of things. So let's get into the different types of testing. So here I found a really great image that Kent C. Dodds put out about testing within JavaScript. You have your base, which is really building your foundation with static tests. These are your typical things that your IDE would help you catch: typos, type errors, things like that as you're writing your code. Next, we have your unit tests. These are really isolated and verify that individual functions are doing what you expect. This can be something as simple as a function that takes in an address object, returns a string with a formatted value. Moving up, you get into integration tests. These are ensuring that several units of your code are working together in harmony. And then finally, the most difficult part of automated testing, especially on mobile, is the tip of this testing pyramid. I like to call it crown jewel: end-to-end tests. These are like autonomous users clicking around your application to verify it's functioning as expected. This is where we'll focus this talk. So some options in React Native for end-to-end testing are Jest, Appium, Native Tests, Detox, and Cavy. And we'll get into these in just a moment. So here we have Jest. This was created by Facebook and offers a pretty simple integration with React Native. However, it's kind of like an incomplete puzzle, missing some of the key pieces. When integrated with React Native testing library, it can test your components, but it's not intended to test the implementation details and user interactions. So is it really an option for end-to-end? From my experience using Jest with Enzyme, it had too many hurdles to overcome. Shallow renders and difficulty in finding elements on the page left a bad taste in my mouth. On the other hand, Jest was is a really great option for unit testing. So here's some sample code utilizing Jest. You can see at the bottom, it's relying on a snapshot of your view in order to validate that what you returned after pressing the button is what you got back. It's not actually clear in this code base what the snapshot even is. If you were new to this code, would you be able to understand what this was testing and the expected return values at a glance? Next, we have Appium. This is a general test framework. It's intended to work across several or with several platforms. Think of it like Selenium for mobile. Because of this, the documentation for specific mobile architectures is really lacking. Appium works on the native layer and can be set up for your language of choice. So you can do JavaScript, Java, Python, etc. It can tend to be a tad bit flaky. Appium's element finding algorithms actually operate on the UI accessibility layer, meaning if certain elements are marked as important for accessibility, it determines others as unimportant, and then Appium can't find them. So here's an example of tests written with Appium configured for JavaScript. You can see at the very top, we're having to import WD, which is WebDriver, and that it's expecting to find elements by accessibility identifiers. So here we are with native tests. As you know, React Native is a cross-platform. You develop mobile applications with JavaScript framework for both iOS and Android at the same time. You can use native tests, but this requires knowledge in native languages such as Swift and Objective-C for iOS or Kotlin and Java for Android. One of the appeals of React Native is that you don't have to be a native developer in order to release a cross-platform application. In addition, you would be writing your tests for both iOS and then again for Android. I'm not a native developer, but I took this example from a Git repository of a React Native project. I don't know about you, but to me, it's not super clear. And a lot of that comes down to I'm not a native developer. The more time I spend in iOS and Android code, I do understand, the elements it is working on, but it is not my bread and butter. And this is just the rest of the test. So finally, let's look at, or I shouldn't say finally, but next, let's look at Detox. So this was actually developed especially to target cross-platform mobile application development. It currently supports both iOS and Android, and you can write a single set of tests in either JavaScript or TypeScript if you prefer. It has the ability to monitor asynchronous activity, allows you to debug and test your application with varying levels of permissions, and more. If you can't tell, I'm a little biased to this testing framework. I won't lie, it's far from perfect, and you'll see that as we dive in a little bit further. It has its own set of problems, but it's better than the other options I've presented so far. Finally, last but not least, very much like Detox is Cavy. Cavy is a framework I actually just recently learned about. It's actually been around for some time, but it's not very known in the React Native community. It claims to have you testing within 5 minutes. It's also a cross-platform and boasts first-class TypeScript support and claims to have easy interaction with CI. Unlike Detox, Cavy is purely JavaScript-based. Therefore, it doesn't tie into the native dependencies. This also means it has some limitations. It can't interact with native elements that you cannot assign a reference to, such as permission dialogues, file pickers, and the camera. So now that we've covered the different types of testing, as well as some of the options for end-to-end testing, specifically for React Native, let's dive in. Obviously, based on the title of this talk, we're diving deeper into integration with Detox. I'll touch a little on Cavy at the end, as I really do see some great potential there, but it's lacking in the native integration at the moment, preventing its use in several of the apps that I work on that require anything like notifications or camera. So at the company I work for, EchoBind, we've developed a React Native template that allows you to start an application rapidly with core features such as navigation, some key components, and a start to integration test with Detox, and a simple sample unit test with Jest. You don't have to go through some of the pain of setting up the extra files, scripts, and configurations. We've already done that for you. So our template can be found on GitHub at EchoBind, React Native template. Like I said, it's a really quick starter. It includes Jest for unit testing, Detox for end-to-end. It has a couple sample components, screens, routing, and some convenience scripts. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Now, like, I was actually just listening to a presentation in the last session hour about demoing. So I'm taking a chance here and I'm doing some live coding. So hopefully everything will go smoothly. We're going to start by initting a project. We'll run some setup and then we'll dive into doing some of the testing. So I'm going to switch over to a terminal window here. So we're going to init using npx with our template for echo bind, which is published up on npm. This will take a moment. Whoops. Oh, see? Look at, we already have my first issue. I had some problems with npm the other day. All right, well, good thing. Like our previous session speaker was talking about, it's always good to have a backup plan. So I actually already have a project that is set up that's already been initialized. We'll go ahead and use that as a sample, and I'll figure out what's going on with my npm here a little bit later. So in VS Code, I have a project here that I have initted through our template. You'll see that we have some convenient scripts like, start, which will start the bundler and reset your cache. We have test for jest. We have another script for doing testing on CI, which can have different parameters. We use HiGen in here for templating convenience features of like, hey, I want to create a new component. I want to create a new screen. And I will show you how to actually, we'll use the one for end-to-end, which will generate a new spec for us. And then we have our convenience scripts for Detox, which will build and test our specs that we create. So we'll go ahead and go back over here. And since I'm not having to go through all of the initialization, it's actually probably going to go a bit faster than I expect. But the setup process after we init helps us do things like rename the project. So by default, we're giving it a name. In this case, I was going to call it PaLOUsa. And so that sets it in a directory called PaLOUsa and sets all of the variables. React Native sets everything like your bundle identifier to that. We have an additional setup script that uses Solidarity. Make sure you have all the dependencies you need, such as CocoaPods installed. And then it will do some renaming and ask if you want to init a or initialize a Git repository. So it'll create the Git reference for you. So after you've initted your project, some of the simple things we can go ahead and do are just like we could run yarn test, which will run our unit test. Again, this is using jest. So I have a simple trim text function in here. And hopefully you guys can see this. I'll bump up the font here. So it should trim a long string to the allotted length and to the default length. So those two tests pass. Those are super simple. Next, we'll go ahead and do our iOS debug of integration tests. So the first thing it does is Detox does an Xcode build. So this, on first initialization will take a little bit longer. Xcode always takes a little while to do its build. And we'll come over here to the simulator. It will pop up here in a minute. The cursor's not displaying. So we'll let it finish installing. So our build succeeded. It's now starting our intro screen test. So it's going to reload the application with default permissions. And right now it's just checking that the intro screen exists with an identifier. So that test already passed. It's still reloading the application after it's done. So let's go look at what intro screen spec looks like. So before each test, it's going to reload React Native. This just makes sure that you're starting from a known point. Some tests build on top of each other, but I suggest that you always start from a known place, because if a previous test fails, it will still run your spec. And if you don't know exactly where it failed, you might end up, starting from a screen you didn't expect. So here it says intro, it should have the intro screen. So it's expecting an element by an identifier intro screen text to be visible. And then it's expecting this element by that same identifier to have the text, welcome to the intro screen. So if we were looking at that simulator, I'm not sure why can't see my cursor. All right, let's close that window. Open it again. Oops. The iPhone is it open? So in our Detox configuration in our package JSON here, you can see for the iOS simulator debug, it's opening iPhone 11 Pro. So I was trying to open the iPhone 11, which is not what I wanted. So we'll go iPhone 11 Pro. Oh, and you have to open up for the right operating system for it. Must be doing it. Oh, all right. This is being super fun for me. So we'll just go ahead and actually yarn iOS, which will build the app on iPhone X, and we can see that here momentarily, and walk through the application. It's super simple. You have a screen, which is your intro screen, and then you have, when you click on it, it'll take you to your login screen. So once this loads up, forgive me for the moment it's going to take to build. What we'll be doing next is navigating from that intro to the login. Verify it has an email and a password input box. Type into both those fields, tap the login button, and verify that it navigates to the expected screen. So those are the tests we're going to be working on here. Oops. In a moment. My computer is not happy with everything running right now, but still doing its compile. I'm gonna hop over here. Finish doing its build. Like I said, if you guys have any questions while this is going on, feel free to type into the chat. Once Xcode builds on a simulator the first time, thankfully it does cache those resources, and subsequent builds are much faster. Compiling. Queue up my next command, which will be to generate the end-to-end spec for the login screen. So as I said, we have the convenience script, which was G for generate, and then colon, and then we have a few different ones. We have component, screen, end-to-end. We use it also in some of our other greenfield projects for setting up migrations and things like that. Getting into the final stages here. We've got our app generated, build succeeded, should be installed on the device here momentarily. Bundler is running. Okay, so as you saw, what we looked for before was that we had this screen. The welcome to the intro screen was there. We didn't verify that the login button was there, but we will be interacting with that momentarily, so you'll see how that functions. If we actually come back over here and we go to our intro screen, you'll see that it was looking for that text identifier intro screen text, and then it validated the inside said, welcome to the intro screen. So that is what was happening in that test. We're now going to go ahead and generate that new spec for login screen, which you can see added a login screen.spec TypeScript file in our end-to-end folder. Screen.spec. So this gives you your bare bones outline. It does some imports for you, convenience feature. It's importing from Detox. You have your basic describe block, which adds in the name that you gave it. And by default, it's doing the before each, saying make sure that we've reloaded the React Native application. So it's starting from a fresh state. And then we're going to go ahead and change this to say, describe our login screen. This one we want to be, we want to describe that it has all of the elements expected. And then we can rename this what we want, and I'll put some stuff in here first. So as I mentioned, we need to get to the login screen first. So we actually need to make sure that we tap our login button. I'm going to copy these so I don't fumble my typing here a little bit. So we're going to await that the element login button is available, and then we're going to tap it. So that means once the application has loaded here, it's going to wait until this button called login button is available, and then it's going to tap it. Then it will start the tests. So our first test that we talked about, if we go back to the presentation, was that we want it to navigate from intro to login. We want it to verify it has the email and password inputs, types into both fields, that we can tap the login, and we verify it navigates to the expected screen. So if we were to interact with this, I don't know why it's not there. Once I have tapped on that button, here's my login screen. So we have an email and a password field. We have a forgot password and a login button. So we are going to set this to automatically interact with our application. So here's some sample code that I was already talking about. This provides the directions of what we want to occur before each test run. So in this case, reload again, and then we log in. So we get to where we expect. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this test. And I will put this in here. So we're going to expect that the element login screen is visible, that the email input is visible, password input's visible, that the forgot password is visible, and then that the login is visible. We're not going to do anything with these buttons yet. Now we're going to come back over here, and we're actually going to run those tests again. And I'm going to, so one thing is we have the convenience script to actually, build and test. So if we're looking at our file again, our configuration in our script here for end-to-end iOS debug does a detox build for the configuration of iOS simulator debug, and then it does a test of the same, and it does a cleanup. What we want to do in this case is I'm going to build it, and then I'm going to test it. And as we rebuild, as we retest, we'll just be able to run the test because we're only making changes in the JavaScript portion and not in the native part of the libraries. So those won't need to recompile, and it will save us some time in our cycles. It's working on a new project for work, and my computer is having lots of fun with Yarn and Node and all right, so it's building, and because it didn't have a lot of changes, thankfully it knew it was already cached, so now it's trying to run. So we'll see it here on this iPhone 11. So it's running those tests. So you can see it's now reloading again to do the next login screen test. So it's launching. It's going to click that login button, and it verified that all of the elements were on that screen. So now that test passed. These tests are taking longer than normal to run, and I think part of that is the network connectivity. All right, so let's get to our next test. We'll add some additional functionality. So now we're going to make sure that it navigates to log in, or it navigates after we click login. So we're gonna copy this test and add that back to our spec here in the same describe block. I'm gonna save it. We'll go ahead and run our command again. Pop back over to our emulator. So each time, we're making a change, we're iterating. Normally in a test cycle, we would be, doing the fail to pass, red to green, minimal code. But for brevity of the presentation, we're jumping right in to show the functionality. So I would normally have a failing test first, write the minimal amount of code I would need, and get my passing test, and then move on. So the intro screen test is already done. We're on to the next. And you guys probably can't hear it, but I can actually hear the tapping. It sounds like the key click as it's popping into those fields and typing out what I told it to type. So it did navigate back to the intro screen, so that test passed. If we look at that, again, we're just validating. We're waiting for an element to be available to us. And then in this case, we use type text for the two different fields. There's other properties you can use, like replace text, which won't then see all of the different clicks happening. There are times where you will prefer to use one over the other. It might depend on, do you have validation occurring as you're typing? Do you have something else that you're expecting to happen? And that will help you know which is the proper property to be using. Then again, we tapped on a button and it navigated, so we made sure that the next screen was available. So then the final one, which wasn't showing here, we'll make sure our final forgot password link is visible and able to be tapped. So in this case, I am actually going to show you a failing test so you can see what that looks like. The app isn't yet configured to know to go anywhere when that button is tapped. So we'll go ahead and run that. Pop back over to the simulator. It's typing into its fields again. Going to do its final test. So here it clicked on forgot password and it got an alert box that popped up. So it hasn't yet failed because it's waiting, but now it failed. So it's going to reload. You can see our failing test here. It failed to navigate to forgot password when we clicked it, and it couldn't find the identifier login screen visible to us. So let's go write the code that is needed for that. That happens to be on our login. And instead of the alert happening, we want it to navigate back to the intro screen. So I'll just make that quick change here. We'll run those tests again. Start to do its refresh cycle. One of the things that's a little bit interesting with Detox is it depends what tests run first. It's really hard to actually configure the order in which you want the test to run. There are ways like Jest has where you can tell it to only run specific tests, but it doesn't always work. All right, so interesting. It didn't seem to pick up our change that we made. Here we are. Forgot password, navigation. All right, so navigate should be working. Let's just test it here. So one of the things, not done, it's done. Simulator's acting funny. It's not letting me interact with it at all. Try this one more time. Forgive me for the fun technical difficulties. Always a risk in live coding. So it looks like it actually navigated this time. I think it's, oh, it's waiting for, what's the test say? Oh, here we go. Wait, expect element login screen to be visible. All right, well, that was part of my problem. We want the intro screen to be visible. I think that's what screen ID is here. So we'll make that change. Once we see that test pass, we'll move forward. These tests can run headless on CI. They can be run in debug or release mode. Obviously, for your CI purposes, you would want to have them running in the release mode. Hey, we got it to pass. All right, we already know intro is going to pass, so go ahead and flip back over here to the presentation. So as I was demonstrating, we have some convenient scripts in there for end-to-end iOS debug, Android debug, and then we also have where you can do both of those also in release. Then we can also run detox commands directly by saying npx detox without having the CLI installed globally. Then there's the build or the test command, and then you pass the parameter of the configuration you want it to run for. There's some really great documentation that Wix has. It talks about the life cycles, the matchers that are available, wait for, which is useful for elements that might take longer to appear based on an API response. So say you are doing a search and that search, has to wait for an API response. So you want to, wait for at least, say 3 seconds or something to make sure you have a response before your test tries to move forward. That's a really good one to know about. And then there's, like I said, there's a lot more. So you can pan and zoom and tap, replace text, all sorts of things. So I shared a lot about iOS, obviously, during that. I did talk about some of the scripts we have available for Android, but I didn't really show you anything about Android. Well, that's because, in full transparency, it can be a little bit disappointing. So remembering for those that are React Native developers already that React Native isn't technically a 1.0 release. We're on version 0.633, I think, currently. This template that I'm using today is React Native 6.2.2. So in the last couple of months, on the previous React Native version, but prior to 6.2, it actually wasn't working for Android at all. And then with 6.2, it was working, and I was so excited to share that it was working again. And when I started doing my dry run this week, I found that I think a Gradle update for Android broke my build again. So there are dependencies, that are a little bit out of the control, and this is a really great reminder of why we have continuous integration tests. And if you say how to nightly build, you would catch that really early on. So when I started preparing for this, everything was, working great. And it's been honestly a roller coaster, working, not working. And I just wanted to let you guys know exactly where it's at. I will share, the configurations for CI that I have found to work. And I have had it actually running emulators on Circle CI. And it works amazingly when the ecosystem is all playing nice together. So now that I shared that disappointing news, let's dig into the continuous integration portion of it and the setup. So something, like I said, that would have helped identify this issue early on if you had, say, a nightly build running. So this gets you into your, code, plan, code, build, test, release, deploy, and then, on and on and on. So two that I'll cover here really quickly are Circle CI and Bitrise. Circle CI is one that isn't targeted at any specific products, whereas Bitrise is targeted specifically for mobile applications. I actually just this week had shared with me a really great bit of documentation online, reactnative-testing.io, which has some great information for Detox as it relates to using it for GitHub Actions and Travis CI as well. So check out reactnative-testing.io for some additional information there. So one of the really cool things is that Fastlane helps bridge the gap between a lot of these CI platforms. It's tool agnostic. You can have a Fastlane YAML file or a fast file that allows you to, put it up on Circle CI, put it on Travis, put it on Bitrise, wherever you want to run it from. So the more that you can actually put into Fastlane, the better off you'll be. We've been moving more and more over into that space. So we do have some Circle CI configuration generators that will help you. I'm going to kind of skip ahead on a little bit of this because some of this is becoming a bit outdated with the new React Native updates that have just recently come out. So we'll be updating our documentation here very soon. What our Circle CI configuration does help you do, set things that will help you in your deploy. So setting your team name, the app name, what branches do you use to trigger what types of builds, and it will get you then a config.yaml file for Circle. We have another plugin that we have for Fastlane specifically, which helps us with our React Native release process. We're actually getting ready to release a whole CLI around just automating this more and more because there are so many commands that are needed for setting up these release processes. It's like, you need to be able to set up match and App Store certificates and all these things. So we're trying to take a lot of that, trying to have to remember all of these other commands and just make it easier and easier to work within React Native. So this will help you encrypt and decrypt values on a standalone context repo. So one of the best practices that we use is having a specific Git repository for our environment and CI variables that are encrypted with cryptics. And then our Fastlane configuration will pull those down decrypt them for us, and then utilize them during the build. So I did mention Bitrise. This allows you to add your app, configure it for Fastlane or however you want to use it, and then, be on your merry way. When I was working with Detox originally, Bitrise was really amazing for working with the simulators. It worked really well with iOS and Android. Unfortunately, it's also one of those that has become a bigger challenge with Detox. Like, it'll build the React Native apps really well, but I had problems getting it to run the emulators the way we expected. Even Wix in their documentation for Detox references configurations that don't work. They just time out. So I just wanted to make sure that I shared that. So software development is a journey. Like I said, I was going to share my learnings through this process. There's bumps along the road without any doubt. As I mentioned while preparing this presentation, I hit several roadblocks. Stuff that had been working well in React Native previously became more unstable. And as it continues to evolve, we're going to continue to see changes and things that we need to adapt to along the way. So I've shared a little bit about our setup for testing and releasing our apps on CircleCI. And what I want to show is the true configurations that I had to make in order to get CircleCI running for these platforms. So part of it was using the React Native community orb. So if you're not familiar with CircleCI, they have a concept of orbs. These are essentially templates where somebody has set up a configuration YAML and then allowed you to pull that in and set just a few properties, which then feed into that template. However, the React Native community orb doesn't even work as expected for testing as it states it will. But I broke it down. There's a really awesome capability from CircleCI with their CLI, which allows you to process the orb and break it down and see the actual steps hiding behind there. And so these are the changes I made. I removed yarn flow because we don't use that in our builds. We don't use it with our template. I had to update the machine it was using because the executor for CircleCI was not current by any means. I think it was on Mac OS 11.1. I removed some brew installs where it was doing, installing Node 8, which is obviously a bit old. I think we're on Node 13 something. And then I set it to use a newer iPhone simulator because it was also using an older one. And then I did some other changes for Android as well, which I'll share. So here you can see a little bit over the next couple slides in the executor here for iOS build and test. I made sure it was running Xcode 11.3.1. In the brew commands here, this is where I removed the node install for 8. I commented it out here. It was not needed. And then down here, sorry, my slide indicator is popping up. The iPhone simulator that I'm running in the background, I wanted it to boot in iPhone 11. So here's a little bit more of this configuration. It creates some caching and makes sure it installs all of your dependencies on the server. And then it actually builds your iOS application. And finally, at the very bottom here, you can see that very similar command, which is detox test. It's doing a detox test for configuration iOS release. It's setting a log level for only warn, and then it's running headless. So that was a secret recipe for iOS, getting it running. Here is some of what I had to do for Android. Down further, what I discovered was that sorry, let me step back for a minute. For Android, on CircleCI, you have Docker containers you can execute on, and you have machine executors that you can build on. So when we're doing iOS builds, we have to use a machine or a Mac OS system because it relies on having Xcode present and the simulators present. Android, on the other hand, you can run cheaper builds because you can run them on Docker containers. However, in order to actually run the emulators for Android, you really need to do that on a machine. And so we have found that if you build and cache your artifacts at the end from a Docker machine, and then we take those artifacts and run the tests on a machine executor, that allows us to have emulators that will respond. So here's the first portion, which is the Android build, where iOS is build and test all in one. This one has to build first. And we go through several settings here. And then here is the Android test. And you can see, again, we have the Mac OS executor with Xcode 11.3.1. We then have several things here where we're, doing homebrew. We're making sure all the simutils are available, that we're installing the Android SDK. Down here, you can see the SDK is being installed, and then we configure the Detox environment. We have to install SDK managers. We have to make sure that the Android environment is all set up as well. So you can see here, we're installing an Android emulator. A little bit further down, we actually are setting up then the Android emulator itself. At the very bottom there, you can see the AVD manager, create AVD. We're forcing it with a name of testing AVD. Then in our actual application package, we would set our Android emulator release to rely on a name of testing AVD. Otherwise, it won't be able to execute to the emulator. So there's some additional things we have to do with Android as well, which is, wait for the Android device to be ready and after it boots. And then finally at the very bottom there, you'll see again that similar detox command calling an Android release configuration. So there were many failures along this journey, but success was achieved. Even with all of those headaches and roller coaster rides I went on, in true Agile fashion, I just continued to iterate. I took my learnings and I tried to improve upon it. I achieved success. You can see here in build 43, I made another change. Build 44, it failed, and I was like, all right, that didn't work. I'll step back. So I'll actually show you even further. Here's the pipeline. So here we go. Number 59. I tried a bunch of new things as I updated the React Native configuration, and I hit many more roadblocks. And then here we got a success at 59 again. And this is where the Android build and the tests were running, as well as iOS. So you can see here it was installing emulators, starting them, and then I'll get all the way down in here to Detox test and see that it actually passed the test that I was running. And they should look exactly like the test that you saw us running locally. So I touched a little bit on Cavy at the beginning. Like I said, I just really recently learned about this pretty awesome testing framework. As I mentioned, it's been around for quite some time, but I'd never heard of it. And I've been digging around with React Native and Detox for a few years now. I was pretty impressed at how easy it was to set up and use, and I wanted to share a preview of what I learned. It has a few limitations, as I mentioned earlier, because it doesn't tie into the native features and the bridges. It may not apply to every application, but there's definitely some use cases where it could be used. So as long as you don't need to accept permissions, use native elements like the camera, location, or file picker, those would allow you to use this framework. So to use Cavy, it's pretty simple. As their website touted, you can be up and running in 5 minutes, and I found that to be true. The longest part actually, which technically took longer than 5 minutes, was just waiting for the installs to occur. So I did the global CLI of Cavy, And then I added it as a dev dependency to my project. I added the TypeScript definitions because I love TypeScript. And then I did an init of Cavy into my project. Cavy has what they call test hooks. So for those that are more familiar with React, React Native, and the newer style with hooks, sorry, I see your question, Rob. How long does it take for the builds to run? It seems like you take a while to get all the dependencies installed and started. Yes, you're right. That is one of the bigger things. I'll actually go back before I continue with Cavy, and you can see how long some of these builds took. This one, just the Android test alone, was 7 minutes from start to finish on the server, but that didn't include actually building the application. So if we look at the pipeline here, so it checked out the code in 34 seconds. The entire thing was like 20 minutes. So, you know, it's one of those things where if you had it running on a nightly build, then, you know, you're obviously not seeing that. Depending upon the CI server that you're using, if you're paying for build time, then that might be something to consider. But I have seen it save me quite a bit of time overall in headaches of like catching errors early. And the iOS builds, honestly, are the ones that take the longest because Xcode build just takes forever. So sorry, getting back over to Cavy. So they use hooks, and it allows you, oops, I found a typo there. So you const a test hook using Cavy, and then you hook it up to your elements. So here is an example of adding it to the intro screen. So where we were using test ID previously, which is what Detox relies on, it's using actual references. And so we generate the test hook for intro screen, and then that's all we need in order to be able to reference that particular element on the screen. When I ran the test, it was as simple as Cavy run iOS. So one of the things I pointed out here is the short amount of time that it took to run these tests, a fraction of a second. When I was running these previously, so today when I was running these tests, I was noticing the intro screen itself was even taking 20 seconds, which normally I would say it's around like 8 seconds. So even 8 seconds versus a fraction of a second is still a huge improvement. And I love that. Again, it's not tying into native dependencies, so the overhead is so much smaller. That was really all I had, unless you guys have any questions. I hope you enjoyed the dive into the deep end of end-to-end testing with React Native. If you have any questions, I'd love to hear from you. I did want to take a moment to thank all of the sponsors of Code PaLOusa that made this all possible. I'm here if you have any questions and want to type them into the chat or turn on your audio. Thank you, Laura. I am staying safe. I'm in Southern Oregon, so not terribly close to the wildfires at the moment, although my husband and I were actually down in California last week on a road trip. Thankfully, we just missed that. Thank you, Tyler. No, we still have some fresh berries. Right now, I actually live on a couple acres in rural Southern Oregon, and ooh, yes, salmon berries, awesome. We don't have any right here. We're currently working on apples and grapes and pears. We have quite a bit growing on our property. Thimbleberries, I actually have never had those. I could go for some huckleberries right now. That's making me think about that. again, I wanted to thank everybody. I know it's Friday afternoon, getting pretty late for a lot of people that are on the other side of the country from me. So I really appreciate you taking time out of your day to come to this talk. If anyone comes up with any other questions, feel free to hit me up. Well, it looks like we're at the top of the hour. I just wanted to thank everybody again. Like I said, you can find me on Twitter or GitHub, see me Jet. Look me up on LinkedIn, however you'd like to connect. My name is Jennifer Robinson, and I really appreciated your time. I hope you all have a great weekend. Thank you.